So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to ASRG World. My name is John Heldreth, founder and your host for tonight. We have a great presentation for you tonight. Gilad Bandel from Argolu is here with us. He's going to talk about IDS and IPS in CANbus and Ethernet applications. Really interesting stuff, especially for the automotive market as we start to transition from this CANbus architecture into more Ethernet related stuff. But before we go into the presentation from Gilad, I'd like to first introduce myself. As I said, my name is John Heldreth. I'm the founder of Automotive Security Research Group, or ASRG. I've worked in the automotive security industry for the last 15 years and recently started focusing on product security. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan in the USA, but today I'm living in Germany and working at Porsche Engineering as the product security team lead. Please feel free to follow me on LinkedIn or other social media platforms. I'm always glad to hear from you. Just quickly, I want to give a short overview of what the Automotive Security Research Group is. The Automotive Security Research Group is a nonprofit company focusing on the advancement of the automotive security industry. This is a community to support the coming together of two areas of competencies, the IT security market and the automotive market. This is a community for you, the automotive engineer, the IT security specialist, the beginner, the hobbyist, even for the people that are probably maybe in the wrong YouTube channel. So we're trying to remove these boundaries that can occur in the automotive security industry. This could be communication, borders, location, finding ways to learn or different solutions, and making good decisions because at the end of the day, we all have the same goals: to keep our customers, our families, our friends, our data safe and secure, which can only be achieved together. We focus on three areas of development: knowledge, networking, and collaboration. For knowledge, we like to focus on increasing security-related competencies within the automotive industry to ensure that the people working on the solutions for automotive products are making the best decisions or recommendations, or so on. Basically, we want to ensure everyone has the opportunity to learn and grow in the automotive security field. For networking, if you can't find the right information, then having a network of professionals is very important. They might know where to look, have a different experience, offer different recommendations. We can't know everything ourselves. However, as a community, we are stronger. Together, we can support each other. The last point is collaboration. Since ASRG is a nonprofit, we are unbiased and offer a space where members and sponsors can innovate outside of the company. This innovation is organized into projects. Some of these projects include threat intelligence platforms, member portals, and so on. If you would like to get more involved and create an impact on the industry, please send us an email at hello@asrg.io or reaching out to us over Slack channels, Telegram channels, or even sending us an old school written letter. That's also possible. We have some really great webinars coming up, and I just want to give you a quick overview so you know what's coming up next week. Next week, we have HackerOne with us, John Botterini. He's going to talk to us about how hacker-powered security can take our organizations to the next level. Really interesting talk here from HackerOne, maybe a little bit different perspective. July 15th, we have Taking the Wheel with Automotive Bluetooth. Kamal Ghali is going to give this presentation, and it's going to be focused on a little bit different time frame. This is planned for the people on the Pacific coasts there, Singapore, Japan, China, and so on, so that they can also join in. But this is a really interesting discussion about how automotive Bluetooth can, take control of your wheel. July 16th, so the day after, we have our standard webinar on Thursdays at the time in European time. CANbus attacks and mitigations. This is Ken Tendo. He's working with Canis Automotive Labs. He's recently released a white paper about mitigating CANbus attacks. So really interesting webinar here as well. On July 23rd, we are going to talk to Enrico Pozzobon. He's going to talk to us about relay attacks on virtual car keys, which is a topic we all love in automotive security. And then in July 30th, we're going to have David Evans with us. He's going to talk about CANbus reverse engineering with Raspberry Pi and SocketCAN. He's going to kind of do a practical example so you can kind of see how it works. So really great webinars coming up. Really interested to see what happens. So great. I actually forgot to go through the questions at the beginning of this webinar because I was so excited to get to the real presentation. So today we have Gilad Bandel with us from Aralu Automotive Cybersecurity, which is a part of NNG Group. He's going to be talking about CANbus versus Ethernet, IDS, and IPS. So Gilad, welcome to ASRG World.
Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. My name is Gilad Bandel. I'm serving as VP Product and Marketing for Arilo. Today's topic is going to be a comparison between the CANbus and Automotive Ethernet IDS and IPS, taking us through the various considerations and various things that characterize each one. So I'm going to compare the CANbus IDS solutions with the emerging Automotive Ethernet IDS IPS. We will draw some conclusions on which features and which lessons we can learn from the legacy CANbus, and they can be applied to the automotive. So there are a few of them which are similar and a few of them which are very different. So we need to understand what we can make use of the existing knowledge and what needs to be changed. Since the Automotive Ethernet is an emerging technology, we need to understand and try to predict where it is going to and what we need to do to protect it. And finally, looking from the perspective of a tier one and an OEM, thinking about what course of action should tier ones and OEM take in this respect. John, if you can please mute the microphone on your end, it can be helpful because there is some noise there. Thank you. One thing is important to say, this webinar will not going to say one word about compliance with standards and regulations, nothing. It's going to be technical only on those items that I mentioned. So a few words about ourselves. Arilo is a automotive cybersecurity company. This is the only thing that we're doing, and we're focusing on this. The company was established more than 8 years ago by some Israeli cyber defense forces veterans. So they came with a lot of knowledge about this area from their military service. Arilo was one of the first companies in the field with solutions and products which were and still are well ahead of the market. We have a lot of experience because we were fortunate enough to meet a lot of tier ones and OEMs and learn and work together and install our product in various environments. So we have quite a lot of experience. The company was acquired about 3 years ago by a large European group, the NNG Group, which is a supplier of automotive software, mainly navigation systems. So we're quite well positioned as an Israeli company in the central of the automotive and cybersecurity field. And from the other side, we do not rely on any venture capital investment, or we're not aligned with any tier one or OEM. So we are totally independent, both financially and professionally. In terms of the products, and this is the reason why we can hold this presentation, because our products are mainly in the IDS, IPS field. To mention a few, the Sentinel CAN is an IDS, IPS for the CANbus. So we can draw some conclusions and lesson learned from this thing. It's not only for pure CANbus, but also going to the SAJ 1939 heavy vehicle solution. So we have a solution for this, and I'm going to speak about it a bit. The Sentinel ETH is the young brother, but larger brother of the Sentinel CAN, providing IDS and IPS for the automotive Ethernet. So there are quite a few things that we're doing in it, and I'm going to speak about them separately. Beyond this, we have additional products. Just to mention one, the CANpress. It is a CANbus message compression, so it's compressing the payload with option of authentication and encryption. So this can enable OEMs to prolong the life of the CANbus, which is, as it is now, overloaded, and saving the need to move to CANFD or the Ethernet for a while, and just make use of the existing infrastructure. And the nice thing is that due to the fact that we compress the messages, we have enough space for a digital signature. So we can add authentication and also encryption. But today focus is going to be on the CAN IDS IPS and Ethernet IDS IPS, and all those slides that you are going to see and all the things that you're going to hear from me today are based on the experience that we have with those two products. So a few words about the CANbus and automotive Ethernet. I'm not going, obviously, to give a lecture about those two things, just to mention a few things which influence the IDS IPS. So both of them are two wires physical, but the CANbus is a bus topology, while the Ethernet is a star topology. That means that on a CANbus, once a message left an ECU, it is guaranteed to reach any neighbor ECU on the same bus. That means that there is no way to stop an attack using a software which resides in the gateway, since it is just listening to the traffic. The only thing that the gateway can do is prevent propagation of messages from one bus to another, but definitely not on the same bus. As opposed to this, the Ethernet is a star topology. That means that on each port there is exactly one device connected, and any message sent by that device can be inspected by the gateway, which gives a lot of power to the gateway to stop attacks. In terms of speeds, the Ethernet is much, much faster. It can reach speeds much superior to the CANbus. That means that the IDS, which is trying to prevent or at least inspect the traffic, we'll need a lot of horsepower to perform this analysis, or we will do a partial analysis of the messages and doing only sampling and not full inspection. Message length. Message length in the CAN is very short, 8 bytes for the CAN, 60 bytes for CAN FD, compared to 1500 bytes on the Ethernet, so much, much longer messages. In terms of source identification, on the CANbus, there is no source identification, so you cannot tell who sent the message. You can do it only with encapsulated protocols such as J1939, but the standard does not have any message origin identification. It doesn't have any distinct destination either. It has a message ID, which is actually a multicast address that anyone can listen to it and use it. As opposed in Ethernet, there is distinct unicast. That means messages have source, destination, and source MAC addresses and destination MAC addresses. Everything is clear. Obviously, you have unicast and multicast as well. So with Ethernet, it's much easier to detect the source of a message. The most complex part about it is the deceiving name Automotive Ethernet. Automotive Ethernet, it's not about Ethernet. It's about all the layers above. So on top of Ethernet, you have IP. On top of IP, you have TCP or UDP. And there are some associated protocols such as AVB, AVTP, ARP. So there are many protocols going up to the application layers, DOIP, some IP, UDP&M, and so on. So it's very complex. You have both automotive protocols and generic IT protocols. So looking at Ethernet to begin with, it's a complex story. And we'll go into it and we'll show how similar it is in some respects and how different it is in other respects. How the process works. The process in both cases is quite similar. So you need to have an IDS. An IDS has to have rules, and those rules need to be used to monitor the traffic. And once something is out of the ordinary, a detection is made. If possible, a prevention is made, and a report is being sent. So both CANbus and Ethernet, we will have a similar process. This is more or less the same process with other ITS and IPS and ITSs. So it's not something very special to automotive, and it's not unique. So you have a learning phase in which you generate the rules. You have a monitoring process, which is 99.99% of the time in monitoring. And if there is a detection, a report goes out. There are some differences, and I gave a lecture on the difference between IT and OT systems. And we have a very static and predictive and deterministic network. That means that we can, with very high confidence, find anomalies, which is very different than your IT system, in which finding anomalies is very complex, because every day you can go to another website and it's very hard to tell what's right and what's wrong. So we're a bit fortunate due to the nature of the network. So let's look at the learning at the rule generation process. So it's similar but different. So for the CANbus and for the Ethernet, we would need recordings. So an OEM will give us the recordings, or we will make the recordings ourselves and generate rules out of it. So this would be our baseline. In addition, we're using files. In CANbus, they are called DBC. Automotive Ethernet, there are quite a few, ARXML, SBXML, other topology files, and so on. And we're using those files to integrate into the rules database that we create. We are also permitting manual editing. So you can edit the rules yourself if needed in both cases. It is wise to let a human being review the rules before sending them into a vehicle to make sure that there are no mistakes on the way. Generating the rule is relatively simple for CANbus. It gets a bit more complex for CANbus TP and for the SAEJ 1939. So there is an error on the slide. It's 1939. And then you do a baseline, and any deviation is deemed as an attack. There are some basic correlation things and context-based anomalies that I'm going to speak later. On the automotive Ethernet, it gets a bit more complex. For example, from car to car, the MAC addresses change. If you use DOIP, then dynamic addresses, IP addresses are being assigned using a protocol called DHCP. So those things make life a bit more complex because things change. And they are dynamic, and we need to understand how to live with them. Another thing that we can add is blacklist. Blacklist is a second layer of defense beyond the whitelist, stating that, okay, we do not know all the cases from the whitelist, and there might be something that slipped. So we build a second layer of defense with blacklist. Another thing which we can do is look at signatures. So there might be a case in which an individual message is okay, but many of them indicate a pattern, and then we can detect an attack pattern. So signature-based detection, in addition to anomalies, are both used in the Ethernet. In CANbus, there are nearly no signature-based attacks, only a denial of service, which is just a plain flood attack. In automotive Ethernet, we can do a lot of sensor fusion and context-based rule sets, so we can do quite a lot of things in the Ethernet. So this is the rule generation, just to give you some visualization of how rules are being generated. This is an example of a DBC file. We take this DBC file and convert it into rules. So this one is anonymized. You cannot tell who is the OEM, obviously, so no problem to show it. We use this to generate rules. A similar process happens on the Ethernet. With the Ethernet, we take this as an example of an ARXML file, and we can generate out of it rules. So the Excel file is actually the rules that we're generating out of the ARXML file. Same process, same concept, much more complex on the Ethernet, many more layers and parameters and fields that we need to understand to generate rules. But the concept is the same. Let's look at the architecture. Basically, more or less the same architecture. So we would be staying in a security gateway. Actually, it can be any ECU. For this purpose, it can be the telematics, it can be the IVI, it can be the powertrain. But most likely it would be the gateway, because all the messages go through this device. So a message CAN or Ethernet will come into the device. It will be handed to us using an API, an SDK which is provided, or a process. We do the analysis and return the message for further processing. If we're an IPS, then we can drop messages along the way. If we're an IPS, we just need a copy of the message to generate an alarm, and we do not need to interfere with the traffic. So this is the architecture. Architecture is very, very similar. Looking where this would go. So if we look at the CANbus, most likely it would go into the gateway. Other cases, we can install it in ECUs themselves, either the connected ECUs such as the telematics or the infotainment, or it can go into safety critical devices to protect them, such as the engine ECU option exists. If we're using only IDS without any prevention, we can do it even without changing anything in the vehicle. So we just need to tap to the CAN buses which are going to the gateway, and we can report independently using the telematics, or using cellular SMS, or any cellular modem using syslog, or any other option that the customer would like to have. In the Ethernet, it's much more distinctive. It would go definitely into the gateway. In this case, this is a hybrid gateway in which it has both Ethernet and other things which are not necessarily Ethernet. So it might go into other protocols as well. It might be connected directly or through a domain gateway. Everything can work. So this is the place where it would be. It might also go into a black box if this thing exists in a vehicle, because the black box has all the information, but obviously it would be only for detection purposes. Now that we are running inside the gateway, let's see what can be done. So first thing, we would look at the message formality. For CANbus, it's very easy. The message is very short, 104 bits. There isn't much place for imagination there. So we can look at the message format to make sure that it complies with the standard. On the Ethernet, more or less, it's a nightmare. So we need to do deep packet inspection, need to go all 7 layers up and see that the format is okay. So we need to analyze the Ethernet frame. That means a legal MAC destination, legal MAC source, ether type, which is in line. The IP header should be according to the right format. So the time to live should be normal, and the version should be in the right place, and the IP addresses should be okay. Going up 1 layer, let's say that we're using UDP, so we need to analyze the UDP header, and then the DOIP PDU header, and in this case, UDS, the diagnostics running on the diagnostic over IP. So we need to analyze this thing as well. So it goes very, very deep into the frame. Means complexity means a lot of work. So there is a very substantial difference between message formality in the Ethernet and in the CANbus, and Ethernet is much more complex. The major thing which would happen is blacklisting and whitelisting, mainly whitelisting. So whitelisting with CANbus is simple. The network is very static, predictable, deterministic. We know which messages should go, which messages should not go. Very easy. It gets a bit more complex when we go to J1939 due to the addressing method and dynamic addressing there. But that's not something that cannot be handled. Blacklisting and whitelisting in Ethernet, it's much, much more complex because we need to do it all the levels. So we need to look at the layer 2, layer 3 IP, layer 4 TCP or UDP, and then layer 5 to 7, the application layers, looking at the protocol itself, and then open all the encapsulation to make sure values are according to the allowed range or allowed behavior on individual field basis. Even after we find this thing, we need to go through a logic. So we have whitelist rules and blacklist rules. So let's say a message was found in the whitelist, then cool, it goes on. But if it wasn't found in the whitelist, we need to go to the blacklist. And if it was found in the blacklist, then we need to drop it. If all else fails, we need to go to a default rule that would determine what would happen with messages which were not found neither in the whitelist nor in the blacklist. And this is a case that should not happen normally. We should be able to protect the vehicle with a blacklist and whitelist, but still, last resort, we have a default rule. I spoke about a few of those complexities. MAC addresses, they change from vehicle to vehicle. So if you have a rule set, then you need to adapt it during production to each of those vehicles, dynamic IP addresses, and so on. So this is blacklisting and whitelisting. Let's take a look of some of those cases. With CAN, it's quite simple. You have valid message IDs, so all the green are in the set of valid message IDs, and suddenly we have a message ID which is not allowed on the bus. Then it is discarded. Obviously, we cannot tell if a valid message originated from the right ECU or from a compromised ECU. You might have a case in which a compromised ECU would send a valid message ID, which is allowed on the bus, but that ECU is not allowed to send it. And if it's not a periodic message, it's practically impossible to determine that this was an attack. Looking at the automotive Ethernet, this is an example of a graphic user interface that we are using to configure the rules. So here we have some whitelist and blacklist rules. And we look at the fields and take each field in the message and define what are the rules which determine it to be a pass due to the fact that it's in the whitelist, or a block because it's in the blacklist. And this is the default behavior that I spoke before. If it's not in the whitelist or in the blacklist, then we go to the default behavior. So this is blacklist whitelist. Blacklist whitelist is the first cornerstone of cybersecurity, but definitely not the most complex one and not the last one. Next, we need to look at message flow. Message flow on CANbus is relatively easy to follow. You might have a request and response, which you can correlate. It's impossible to determine the origin of the issue, so you don't know where this came from. And if you really want to determine the origin of the issue, you need to add some digital signature to make sure that the flow originated from the right place. So that would be either using our CANpress with the digital signature, or SecOC, or any equivalent method to determine the origin. And then you can follow that the flow is not only correct in terms of messages, but also from the perspective of the origin. Looking at the automotive Ethernet, you can see the flow. I'm not going to go into the details of it. It's just for the impression of how complex it is to look at the flow. So we need to follow the flow at the, for example, TCP/IP. So there is a three-way handshake. You send the SYN, you get an acknowledge and sync from the other side, and you send an ACK back. So this way the TCP session was established. And then you start to establish the DOIP. So you need to ask for routing and receive acknowledgement for routing, and then ask for a request, and then receive a response. And you cannot receive a response without a request, because that would be an unsolicited response. Some IP and some IP SD have similar behaviors. So it's very complex to follow the Ethernet flow. And there are many attack scenarios that can be done based on overriding the flow, tampering with the flow, trying to hijack a session, and so on. So following the flow is critical. A few examples. This is a flow, very simple flow of messages, which should appear at a predetermined interval. So in this case, we have a message which is totally out of the interval. So let's say the interval is 20 milliseconds, and this one appears after 14 milliseconds. So we definitely know that this message should not be here. Actually, it can be discarded. A bit more complex case is this case in which two messages arrived within the tolerance. So let's say we are 20 milliseconds plus minus 2 milliseconds. So in this case, we have two messages, and unless there is some other indication, we cannot tell which of those two messages is the offending message. So we know that something happened, but we cannot point out which is the offending message. So this is, even with CANbus, in some cases, following the flow is not as simple as that. In the Automotive Ethernet, we took the some IP example, and there is something which is called events with some IP. In this case, those events are supposed to arrive at fixed intervals, and if they fail to appear in this interval, then we know that something went wrong. So it's very similar in the behavior with with the CAN messages. Other cases. Here we have messages which appear in pairs. So let's say it's a request and response. So you have the A, which is the request, B, which is the response. As long as they appear in pairs and within a predefined time, then we know that those pairs are okay. We can have odd behavior. For example, twice a B message. So this might be someone trying to inject a B message and try to fool the system with wrong data. So this is a case that can be detected because we see two B messages without an A message preceding it. And it might be even in wrong timing. Another case in which message B disappeared. So there is a request, but there is no response. So those cases appear in CANbus. Looking at Ethernet, with Ethernet, we have similar cases. Some IP in this case. We have request and response. We have a find and forget. We have get and set. All those need to be followed and need to be monitored and make sure that they appear in the right order and provide the right information. And there are no unsolicited messages and so on, if they are not allowed to be. And we need to make sure that only those clients and those servers that are allowed to communicate are communicating. So there's quite a lot of work to do here. Ethernet is by far more complex to follow in this respect. So this is only looking at the protocol itself. I did not go even into the signals themselves. So let's look at some anomalies with respect to the signals themselves. Let's say we have an allowed range, and as long as the signals are within that range, that's fine. But if they go above or beyond that range, that means that something terribly wrong happened. So if it is physically impossible for a vehicle to go over 300 kilometers per hour, and we see 400 kilometers per hour, then we know that someone is trying to fool with the instrument cluster, with other systems in the vehicle. The behavior with CANbus and with Automotive Ethernet would be the same. So we would look at those cases and determine if this is something out of range, then we can report them. And it's not only range, there are many more cases. I'm not going to go into them today. For example, just to mention a few, change rates. So if you're doing 10 kilometers per hour and 100 milliseconds later, you are doing 100 kilometers per hour. In most cars, this is physically impossible, except for John's cars, which is a Porsche, in which obviously this can be done. but this is only because it's a Porsche. So those cases are not possible in physics. So a change rate would be regarded as a cyber attack, and there are many more. We can look at relations, correlation, and things like this. So this is a very it's way beyond deep packet inspection. It's looking at content, deep content inspection, and it's quite complex to analyze. Let's look at a signature attack. I took a very simple signature attack, which is a denial of service. Denial of service is actually, in this case, a flooding of the bus. So for a period of time, the number of messages which appeared on the bus is way beyond anything which is anticipated. The thing happens with CANbus, it happens with Ethernet. In the Ethernet, it's even conceivable to have a distributed denial of service. That means if you compromise ECU are sending large amounts of data on the bus. So it might be that each ECU is sending only within the limits, but the combination is well beyond the capability of the victim to handle. So this is a signature attack. There are many more signature attacks that do not appear here. We can mention two of them. For example, port scanning. A compromised ECU is trying to reach out to all the other ECUs and trying to determine which ports are open, and then trying to make use of those ports. Maybe someone left a debug port open. So the way to do it is to do port scanning. If the port answers, then we try to establish a connection to that port, and through that port trying to perform a remote code execution or give commands to that ECU and do some harm. So a port scanning, it's a scenario, it's a signature scenario that cannot be determined by one message, because one message is okay. It's okay to try to open a port, but it is totally inconceivable to see a scenario in which in normal circumstances you would try to open many ports one after the other. By the way, denial of service attackers are trying to fool the system, and instead of opening them in a row, so going 1, 2, 3, 4, they are using randomized numbers. But still, the signature is detected by good signature detection engine. Operational consistency. We expect a vehicle in parking mode to have a zero velocity. That means that the rate of the rotation of the wheels should be zero. If we read 50 kilometers per hour from the spinning of the wheels and we are in parking mode, something very badly happened along the way. So this is operational matching and consistency. It can be done in CANbus, and we have quite a few cases that we do it. It can be done in Ethernet. It's a bit deeper. A lot of sensor fusion, which enable us to determine if one reading is out of order, so we look for a misbehavior. Another very interesting thing would be interaction with the V2X. This is a long-term item in which we can use external data to check ourselves, and on the other way round, check the incoming data from the V2X to make sure that it's not a cyber attack from the infrastructure or from other neighboring vehicles that have a compromised device on board and is trying to create a mess around. So looking at the operation matching and consistency can be done both in CANbus and Ethernet. In Ethernet, it can be done probably much more. By the way, it doesn't mean that if we are using Ethernet, we cannot use information from the CANbus. So if we have access both to the CANbus and to the Ethernet, then we can use both. If I'm trying to think what is the direction of the industry, then Ethernet is going to be the core network in the next few years. But I do believe that OEMs will keep the safety critical systems on the CANbus for quite a few years, saying that if it ain't broken, don't fix it. And due to the fact that CANbus has a lot of track record of safety, we would see hybrid cars which have a combination of Ethernet and CANbus, when the Ethernet will be the core and CANbus will be in islands, specifically speaking, the safety-related issues running CANbus. Another point of view worth mentioning is the vehicle context. So the vehicle can be off, accessories on, starting. The rules need to change. Not all the messages appear in accessories as in on. So we cannot expect for a periodic message which appears only when the vehicle is in the on state to appear in the accessories mode. So the IDS need to be aware of the vehicle current context and use the right rule set which applies to this specific state. How we know? It's a good question. It can be either provided to the IDS by an API, or we can listen to the traffic. For example, it can be a SAM-IP client, listen to the SAM-IP traffic, subscribe to the SAM-IP messages, and be informed when the vehicle changes the context, and therefore we can change our rule set to correspond with the right context of the vehicle. Diagnostics, long, complex item. Even with CANbus, one would state that if we're speaking about OBD, IDS should not be there. And the reason is that if someone is able to access your vehicle and plug something into your OBD, then it would be much easier to plant a bomb under the seat and detonate it at the designated time. So there is no reason why we should protect things like accessing the OBD. I don't believe this is the case, and I believe that we should look at diagnostics and we should look at the diagnostic port, and there can be diagnostic messages running remotely through the telematics. So it's not as simple as that. When speaking about diagnostics, we mainly look at the UDS protocol. The UDS on the Ethernet is layered on the DOIP piggyback. In the Ethernet, it's a bit more complex because everything runs over IP and you need an IP address. And when you reach a workshop, that workshop needs to assign the vehicle an IP address, which is digitally dynamically assigned using a protocol called DHCP. It can be other way, like using a PIPA, which is a dynamically self-assigned IP address, link local. So there are many cases there. Another interesting thing is that in a workshop, there is more than one vehicle. And all of those vehicles are connected to a switch, which is connected to the testing equipment, which is monitoring more than one vehicle. So if the switch in the workshop was not configured correctly, and the user-to-user option was not prevented, so it should be a multiplexer, not a full mesh switch. and it should be enabling only traffic from the testing equipment to each individual vehicle, but in no way from one vehicle to another. Nevertheless, I do anticipate that not everyone is going to go this way. And theoretically, one vehicle will be able to attack a neighbor vehicle, and the neighbor vehicle, without the right protection, will not be able to determine whether it is speaking with the testing equipment or with the neighbor vehicle. Those are cases that we need to look at. So looking at diagnostics is quite interesting and quite a challenge, both in the CANbus and in the Ethernet. Even if there is authentication on top of it, still it's quite complex to manage it. Looking at the media. Currently, the media is using a protocol called MOST, which is excellent because it is separated, unrelated to the CANbus. Can even claim that it's nearly air-gapped. Not that air-gapped is security, but it's better than nothing. So it's nearly air-gapped. It is not inspected. It is not regarded as an attack scenario. It cannot affect the engine. And more or less, the worst thing that you can do is to show the wrong picture on the back screen. This is the worst that you can do with it. On the automotive Ethernet, it's a bit more complex, and we have quite a few problems with it. So it is using the same infrastructure. It's using something which is called AVTP, Audio Video Transport Protocol, IEEE 1722, 1733, taking audio and video codecs and conveying them over the network. So it's the same network. So you can be very close to other safety critical devices. From the other side, it's practically impossible to inspect all the AVTP traffic. So at most, you might be able to do some very, very partial sampling, looking for protocol integrity, but nothing more than this. So the best thing to do is to go into a secure by design approach and try to separate using VLANs, using physical separation, using any other means, so that the media will flow as remotely as possible from the other signaling, some IP, DOIP messages. Quality of service. CANbus, there is no quality of service. It's very simple. There is only bus arbitration done via the message ID, and the lower the number, the higher the priority you have on the bus. End of story. Ethernet, basic Ethernet does not have any quality of service embedded into it. It is a best effort protocol. And the concept is that as long as you have enough bandwidth, you don't need any quality of service because you have enough bandwidth. So why would you? Quality of service comes from a few reasons. One of them is keeping the media in sync. So there are some Ethernet add-ons like IEEE 802.1p and Q, providing VLANs and quality of service, very rudimentary, very simple, nothing to write home about. In the automotive, we have the AVB, audio video bridging, which is providing quality of service and time synchronization. So all your speakers in the vehicle will play at the same time and will be in sync with the picture, and the lips will move at the same time that you hear the sound. So this is what you have in quality of service in automotive Ethernet, which makes life quite hard to follow because the protocol is not trivial at all. It's a quite complex protocol. The implementation of it is done in hardware, so every switch should support some hardware quality of service and queuing. So following the protocol and following what it's doing, it's a bit of a mess. So for now, I don't see many people running into implementing the AVB, and when they will do, it won't be the first thing on which an IDS would work on. So this is something that we would see in the future, both in terms of implementation and in terms of protection. So now we've got all the events and we found attacks and we found suspicious things and we want to report them. And the IDS needs to report to somewhere. On the CANbus, the prime suspect would be the telematics. So the CAN IDS will send a telematics message, which will be conveyed through the telematics to the SOC, and it will be analyzed there. Obviously, there are other options. We have a case in which we had an independent cellular modem, and we sent syslog messages directly to the SIM in the SOC. So those options exist as well. In the automotive Ethernet, there is a lot of flexibility, much more than in CANbus. Messages can be conveyed through an API, through a neighboring a microcontroller, so it need not be any automotive interface. It can be an SPI interface. Makes lots of sense to send the telematics message using some IP, and then it goes to the SOC. It can even go directly through the vehicle gateway that has a cellular modem in it, using syslog. For example, below you can see a CEFCF format of a syslog message, and it goes directly to the SIM. And obviously, there are more options. But we need to keep in mind that the IDS needs to report to the SOC in case of an event. There is a lot of discussion in the industry whether the vehicle should do detect and respond, or detect and prevent. Detect and prevent means that the vehicle needs to be active and needs to perform intrusion prevention, which has some risk associated to it, because due to a bug in the software, the IDS might cause an accident. And then the question, who is liable? So OEMs in general would normally prefer to go with an approach of detect and respond later. Regulation is more inclined towards detect and prevent, because it relates to the individual vehicle, and the OEM looks more at the fleet. But this is a very generic statement, that it's not correct for every single case. So it's just a point of view, not necessarily a physical fact. But in any case, reporting needs to go to the SIM for analysis. Looking at updates, very similar process, going using FOTA, using the OEM mechanism. Need to keep in mind the most important thing from this slide is that separately the rules and the software can be updated. So if there is a change in the rules, for example, a new software was downloaded into an ECU, and new messages will appear on the bus, and those messages need to be whitelisted, then the associated rules need to be updated. So those two things need to happen in tandem, not necessarily updating the IDS software. So those are the two things that that would happen, updating rules and updating the software. Everything that you saw here takes a lot of resources. And we need to think where this goes to and who does what. In CANbus, it's quite simple. Nearly everything is done in software. And the secure gateway is inspecting messages which is going from one message to another, from one bus to another at the message level and forward them accordingly. So it's basically a router. In the automotive Ethernet, we must offload as much as possible to the switch fabric. So it's not a software-only product. A software-only product would be limited by the CPU power of the microcontroller. So we would very much like as many rules as possible to implement in hardware using the TCAM, using rate limiting and other tools that are available from one SOC to another. So when a tier one is selecting the platform for the gateway, this chip, the chip that is going to perform the switching and CPU function, two major considerations need to be taken into account. The first of all, how much of the cybersecurity pre-processing can be done in hardware. Does it have only 48 bytes of TCAM or 96 bytes? How deep does it go? If you have only 48 bytes, you can go only up to layer 3. If you have 96 bytes, then you can go quite deeply into the OOP and some IP protocols. So a lot of the activity can be done by the switch fabric. How many entries are there? Do you have 256 or 2000 entries? The more entries you have, that means more rules can be done by the switch fabric. The next is the CPU. How strong the CPU is there? Is it an ARM A3, M3, M7? What is the clock rate? And so on. How much memory you have? How much flash do you have? So those things will determine a lot which chip is going to be selected by the tier one as the platform for the gateway. Speaking about form factors, this is not pure science. It's just for indication. So don't take those numbers as absolute numbers. But in general, you would use on a CANbus a very relatively weak CPU. In this case, we are looking at an ARM Cortex M3. In comparison, on the automotive Ethernet, you would need at least a Cortex M7 multi-core, at least half a gig of RAM, and so on. So automotive Ethernet will require a lot of horsepower to do the IDS IPS, especially if you want to do it on the same chip as the switch and not on a separate chip, which will increase the pricing. This concludes the presentation. Anyone who is interested in a live demo will be more than happy to hold live demos for you. So this is my email address, gilad@bandel@nng.com. You are more than welcome to write to me, and I will shortly revert to you and will be more than happy to coordinate such a demo. Last slide from my perspective is the take-home messages. So a few things to take in consideration. Threat and risk on the automotive Ethernet due to the fact that we inherited from the IT industry and from the ICS SCADA industry, there are so many attack scenarios there. Furthermore, new code from software engineers means bugs. Bugs means vulnerabilities, which are translated into exposures, which are translated into attacks. So it's not theory, it will happen. It's only a question of when. And if we took enough steps before to prevent it. There are several areas which are similar to the CANbus, mainly in the automotive behavior, context, states, gears, physical behavior. Those can be used with the same concept. Others cannot. So the IDS and IPS for Ethernet is more complex than the CANbus. To design a good IDS IPS, you need a lot of expertise and a lot of knowledge. And it's in many fields, both on the networking level, in the cyber level, and in the automotive field. So to develop such a new thing, you need a lot of diverse expertise, which is best found in companies that this is their bread and butter, and this is what they did for many years. And in our case, we did it for quite a few years, and we have a lot of patents which protect our IP. So we are very well positioned in this respect. Looking from the OEM and Tier 1, yes, you must have an IDS IPS, probably best suited in the gateway, and with a source, a vendor which is well established, reliable, experienced, and can provide the best in-class products. For any additional information, you are welcome to visit our website at arilotech.com. And for updates and news and interesting information, please follow us on our LinkedIn page at linkedin.com company@/Arilo. So this would be all from my side this evening. I'm all open to questions. So John, over to you if you have gathered any questions along the presentation. This would be a good time.
Yeah, Gilad, first of all, thank you very much for such a informational presentation. Really interesting stuff here. We do have quite a bit of questions here. If you do have more questions, please go ahead, add them to the live chat window. But let's start here, Gilad. Marcus was asking, how can we handle variants or the product specific configurations and updates with white and blacklist?
Okay, so this is an issue which is in CANbus it's a bit more simpler. So in CANbus you would, for example, create a superset of all the possible messages, of all the possible assembly options that you might have, and download them into the rule set of the vehicle. And if some of the messages do not appear, they can be disabled, inhibited. And if the new ECU is installed later, then those rules are being activated. A bit more complex is the case of aftermarket ECUs. In this case, the aftermarket ECU needs to be coordinated with the OEM, so associated rules will be applied and downloaded either remotely or by the workshop that installed them through the diagnostics. Other case of variants might be, let's say, the Ethernet. When you move from vehicle to vehicle on the assembly line, the MAC addresses change. So each vehicle would have ECUs with unique MAC addresses. So that means that during the assembly phase, you would need to go through a calibration of the rules so they fit the MAC addresses of each individual vehicle. And if one of these ECUs is later replaced, then the rule needs to be updated so it won't generate alarms on a new MAC address. From the OEM perspective, it is interesting because if someone is trying to tune or replace or add or mess with ECUs, in many cases, this would result in misbehavior. Misbehavior will be detected as a cyber attack. So if messages are received through the telematics, so an OEM would know that someone tried to mess with the vehicle, and not necessarily it was a cyber attack per se with the target of harming the people or the property, but actually harming the vehicle because it would create damage to the vehicle due to ECU tuning or due to adding clone ECUs from unreliable sources. So there are quite a few additional ways to monetize out of the IDS, not necessarily looking at the cybersecurity perspective. Hope that I answered this question.
Okay, yeah, definitely. I think that answers the question for sure. Another question here is, how does the signal check work together with signal encryption? On the Ethernet channels. MACsec would work? IPsec or TLS could be an issue. How to manage this encryption topic?
Okay, this is an issue. A few things from my perspective of secure by design, and then how those things would work. So in my view, in the vehicle, the concern is more for message authentication, integrity, preventing replay attack, and less on privacy. So I don't see really any reason why messages in the vehicle should be encrypted. It just adds more delay on the encryption and then the encryption side. So professionally, I don't see any reason. If this approach is being taken, then the message body is in clear, and the IDS can listen to the message body without being part of the trust chain and key distribution environment, and that would work marvelous. Let's look at encryption. Let's say that the OEM decided that privacy is important and the delay added due to the encryption and decryption worth it, and we added the privacy to the messages. Then the IDS would be part of the key distribution, and it would receive the decryption keys, and it would be able to decrypt the messages. Depending on which level. If it's done on a Mac OC, then it's relatively simple. MACsec on the Ethernet, relatively simple. IPsec, relatively simple. TLS, it's a bit more complex because it's not an infrastructure protocol. It's a bit more complex protocol, but keep in mind that TLS means TCP. Not all automotive protocols are using TCP. I would be more inclined into using UDP because UDP is much faster. And having TCP does not make very much sense in all the scenarios because you want to have the answers, the messages reaching the other side very fast, and then you would use UDP. If you use UDP, that means that you're using IPsec. IPsec is a layer 3 encryption protocol, while TLS is a layer 4 protocol, and it runs over TCP. So in all those cases, we would need to be part of the trust chain and receive the keys, so we would be able to decrypt the messages if privacy is being employed.
Okay, thank you, Gilad. Moving on to the next question. This is from Noam. In network IDS, IPS, you look for known patterns like the traffic generated by known worms. So I think he's talking about IT stuff.
Yeah.
Code that exploit vulnerabilities in services, unrelated access to resources. How do you do this in CAN Ethernet bus? And are you limited to theoretic attacks, or there are libraries of real attacks in CAN or Ethernet buses for automotive?
Okay, so the IT industry is by far more advanced than the automotive industry, mainly due to the fact that it's about 50 years ahead of us. I strongly suggest to read a set of articles that I published on our website, which is comparing cybersecurity between IT, OT, industry control system, and SCADA, and the automotive, which I think would give Noam the best answer because it's comprehensive, deep, and it looks from different perspectives. And definitely here and now, I cannot give all the information, but trying to be very specific. Cyber intelligence, cyber threat intelligence in the IT is very deep. If you look at Mitre, they have a list of tens of thousands of CVs, common vulnerabilities and exposures. Most of them are from the IT. Some of them are from the neighboring ICS SCADA, and very few of them from the automotive. We found a few vulnerabilities. For example, you can do a flood on, it was, as far as I remember, DOIP-TP protocol, and we demonstrated it more than once. You can just do a flood there and mess with the protocol. So trying to, can you please repeat the questions again? Because I just forgot all the items that he mentioned.
Of course. So how do you do this in CAN Ethernet bus? So looking for these different known patterns. And then are you limited to theoretical attacks, or are there libraries of real attacks in CAN Ethernet buses?
Okay, so in CAN buses, the information and the cases are very, very limited. So there are vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities in ECUs and in a few ECUs, and they can be exploited into attacks. So the answer is yes, but they are relatively few. As I said, the threat intelligence and the cooperation in the industry and the sharing of the information is very, very limited. And tier ones are not very happy to share this information with everyone, and they prefer to keep it to themselves. And you can find quite a few bounty hunters which are providing information to the specific tier one and refrain from publishing it to the public. In the Ethernet, it's much wider because the variety of attacks from Ethernet, from IP, from TCP, from UDP, using ARP, using DHCP, even not related to the automotive, just on the plain generic protocols, it's quite wide. Keep in mind that many devices are running operating systems such as Linux, automotive Ethernet Linux, and AutoSAR, and both of them are not plain writing over bare metal. This is an operating system. This translates into vulnerabilities. There are libraries of attacks and example of attacks on all those things. In specific to the automotive, there is a body called ISAC, which is doing some threat intelligence. there aren't so many published attacks compared to other fields. So part of it is from our own cyber research, part of it is from public domain, part of it is from theory. It's a combination. It is the good news is that it is growing. So there is more awareness, more cooperation, more information sharing in this area, and therefore more attacks are being published. That means that tier ones can fix those things before they are being compromised and used by hackers. But in any case, Ethernet is very young in the automotive industry, and there isn't enough experience today to have a real good feeling of how deep the problem is. We need to wait a few more years.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I totally agree here, Gilad. This is something that I feel that ASRG should also be supporting. If every OEM decides how these signatures look or how these known attacks work, then they only protect themselves and not industry wide. So it's very important for us to have some type of information sharing. And I'm not sure what level makes sense, but I'm not sure if government makes sense or somewhere in between. But it's definitely very important for us to share these types of vulnerabilities between them.
So in the IT industry and the ICS-CADA, it started from governments which pushed, and as the industry got more and more mature, and the understanding came that the more you share, overall you gain more, and you do not lose by sharing, then it happened on its own. So today, threat intelligence is a public thing that anyone that finds a vulnerability in the IT publish it. From the other side, in our experience, without giving any names, we found a vulnerability in a publicly domain software provided by one of the players in the market. All our attempts to go to a public common PR failed.
Yeah.
So they fixed it very fast. They replaced the code on a public server, and not even thank you. So it's a different culture, very protective, very defensive, and this is not the right way. You gain much more security by sharing than by holding back.
Yeah, totally agree. And actually, this is the type of culture that we need to change in the industry, not only for the companies themselves, but the entire industry needs to be collaborative, cooperative about sharing information to save lives. I'm completely with you. We do have one last question here. Raul is asking, what are the limitations with rule-based IDS? Is there a viable machine learning approach to CANIDS, and what are the limitations there?
So yes, we are employing machine learning. On the CANbus, we have a lot of experience. So the vast majority of work is done automatically. So we take recordings, we take DBSs. Very shortly afterwards, we have a set of rules. Furthermore, we were asked more than once by customers to do it on their own, so they would not rely on us. It's perfectly in line with our concept that we are a software house, not a professional service provider. So we're very happy to give this knowledge and tools to our partners and customers, so they can do them on their own, so they don't need to call us if they need to change a rule. On the Ethernet, we do whitelisting, and we can demonstrate with whoever is going to join the demonstration. We're going to show how we do automatic whitelisting based on learning from the traffic. Again, not enough experience in the market to determine how 100% automatic it is right now. We can anticipate that yes, it will be, because the principles are the same, but it would be presumptuous of me to say that I know now the answers, because we are still in a too early stage in the industry. I think that in 2-3 years, we'll be much smarter and will have much more experience to come with more absolute statements about the capability. But definitely, this is the direction: machine learning, automation. The only reason that we mandate some human being in the middle for the long term, and we will keep it, is because there needs to be a human being signing and being responsible, and can be fired in case something went wrong. So this is the reason why we keep this. Another reason why we keep a human being in the loop is to make sure that in the remote case that during the recording, the system was already under attack, the machine learning will learn the normal behavior of the attack as a normal behavior. And this is something that a machine learning will find very hard to determine, that during the learning phase, it was actually under attack. So this is another reason why machine learning is okay, but a human being signing off the rules is necessary.
And Gila, just to extend on that, are you doing on the sensor level? So are you guys building behavioral relationships between sensor information and or signal information, I guess is more appropriate, plausibility? Because how can you do that from an external point of view?
Okay, so this was one of the slides that I decided to take off. I will just give an example of how plausibility is done. Let's take two things. The velocity of the vehicle as it appears on the instrument cluster, and the rotation of the vehicle, of the wheels. There must be a correlation between those two numbers. So if there is a certain velocity on the instrument cluster, let's say 100 kilometers per hour, no way your wheels are turning at 1 revolution per second. Physically impossible. So this is a place where we take a few parameters. This is a very simple example, and do some plausibility to make sure that those numbers make sense together. So each number is okay. Each number, yes, you can do 100 kilometers per hour. That's okay. It's within the vehicle range. Yes, you can have 1 revolution per second on your wheel. And yes, this is okay. But both together cannot work. No way this can happen. So this is a very simple case of plausibility and misbehavior detection. It will go in due time much more complex into the V2X, because then you need to look not only at your vehicle, but also at an external source and try to determine what went wrong. Even in your vehicle, if you have two sources, for example, the GPS and the velocity based on the wheel rotation, those things should match. And if they don't match, something went wrong. Yes, you can be towed away while the engine is on, and then you would have the velocity of your towing machine up beyond the GPS and 0 on your wheels. So this is an interesting case that you need not to generate a false alarm. And false negative and false positive is another topic that we can discuss in another time.
Yeah, definitely. Gilad, I would love to talk about this all night. And I'm sure some of the participants would as well. Unfortunately, we do need to come to an end here. Gilad, before we end, would you like to say anything to the audience?
Thank you, everyone, for listening. If it was interesting, please send your feedback. If it wasn't interesting, please send your feedback and I'll try to do better next time. And thank you, John, for hosting me here today.
Of course, Gilad, this is your second webinar with us. We are always appreciative to have you with us tonight. So thank you very much, first of all, from ASRG point of view. For the audience, guys, thank you very much for joining as well. We do have some more interesting talks coming up in the future. So please check back often, www.asrg.io, or you can reach us over the Slack, Telegram channels, and so on. Get involved. Automotive security, community-driven ASRG. Thank you for joining tonight. We'll see you guys soon.